Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Emmanuel Christian Seminary for the last seminar of this fall semester here at the Emmanuel Institutes. 2 years ago, we began a series focused on the preacher, the multiple roles of the preacher. We've looked at 6 different facets of the work of a minister in the daily care of the church. And tonight, we're going to wrap that series up by considering the topic of balancing the multiple roles of the preacher. I am delighted tonight to introduce to you Robert Shannon. Bob has preached for well over 50 years in many different places, in many different contexts. He has served and equipped preachers behind the Iron Curtain. He has served in numerous leadership roles, such as serving as the president of the North American Christian Convention for the Christian churches and churches of Christ here in the United States. Bob has written widely. He's taught in more schools than either one of us could ever count, I'm certain. And for a large number of us who have grown up in the ministry over the last 20 to 40 years, there would be very few people that we would look up to more than Bob Shannon. I introduced him to the chapel the other day as a pulpit prince. I don't know if that's an appropriate way to say it or not, but that's the only way I could think to say it. And so I'm very grateful, Bob, to you for the time you've taken to prepare for tonight and making the trip down from Boone, North Carolina, where Bob and Jean now live. Bob's son, Mike Shannon, is a Milligan grad and is serving in a leadership role at Cincinnati Christian University, where, among other things, and not surprisingly, he teaches preaching and homiletics. So thank you for being here for this important wrap-up to a very valuable series that we've been able to offer through the Institutes. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, the calling that we have to proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ is such a humbling calling. It's overwhelming. It can be intimidating for us. There is so much to keep track of, so many things to balance. And there are times like this evening when we can come together and listen to one who has gone ahead of us and has truly been a trailblazer on the path of preaching, fine preaching, through your church. So we ask your blessing upon Bob as he comes. We thank you and celebrate his glorious ministry that continues, and ask that you prepare all of us to hear with ears that you have prepared, so that we walk out of here better preachers of the gospel than we came in. This is our request, and this is our expression of gratitude through Jesus Christ. Amen. Bob, welcome to the Emmanuel Institutes.
Thank you. Well, John picked the right word when he picked the word balancing, because it is certainly a balancing act. We cannot say with Paul, this one thing I do. Of course, Paul was talking about something very different than what we're talking about tonight, but we cannot be specialists. You know that the people in your church are very unhappy with doctors who are specialists, because that doctor's focus is so intent on one thing that you might be dying of 3 or 4 other things that he wouldn't even notice. And if they're that impatient with doctors who are specialists, we can imagine they probably are impatient with us if we undertake to be specialists. I saw in the minister's directory a preacher who had taken out a full-page ad about himself. Now, I thought that was rather extraordinary. He had a picture of himself and his lovely wife. My daughter said she got so tired of hearing us being introduced as Bob Shannon and his lovely wife, Jean. Just once, she would like to hear an introduction of Jean Shannon and her lovely husband Bob, which so far has never happened. But in his ad, he says that where he preaches, his primary responsibility is to write and preach sermons. I guarantee you there are people in his church who do not think that those two things are his primary responsibility. In the first place, most of our people don't really suppose that we write sermons. They think you just get up and talk out of your head. And of course now, with the internet, a lot of the material is coming from cyberspace, and a lot of us are reaping where we have not sown and gathering where we have not strawed. Somebody said that the borrowed sermon, like the counterfeit coin, doesn't have the right ring to it. And I don't know how they know it, and they don't know how they know it, but listeners know if the voice is Jacob's but the hand is Esau's. But they don't really think that this is a major responsibility of ours, even though we know that it is. Harry Emerson Fosdick some years ago was called to the famous Riverside Church in New York City, the Church of the Rockefellers. And they said, now all you have to do is preach. We have a staff to take care of everything else, and we are simply calling you to preach. And Fosdick said after a few weeks, he couldn't preach because he was no longer in touch with people. There was no longer the give and take that he had had in an ordinary ministry. So we do have to balance all of these multiple roles. First of all, there's the tyranny of time. There's never enough of it. I was out on the West Coast many years ago and heard a preacher out there, a member of his staff, who said, if you are within the will of God, you will always have enough time. Well, in the first place, I thought that's nonsense. And in the second place, I thought it was hyper-Calvinism. The fact is, you are never going to have enough time. And you're going to have to budget your time as you go along. We had a preacher in Florida, David Meyer, who gave his people the best pastoral care of anybody I ever knew. If somebody sneezed, he was there with a Kleenex. He was succeeded by a preacher whose strong suit was evangelism. And after a while, the leaders called that preacher in and said, you're not doing your job. He said, yes, I am. You don't know what my job is. So there's this tremendous tyranny of time. How do we use it? Of course, we're all worried that we don't have enough time with our family. Someone asked my son in some talk he was giving, did he resent the fact that I didn't have much time to spend with him? And he said, no, he didn't. Because he said, whenever he missed something that I was in, I always knew he wanted to be there. We're not the only people who are taken from our families to do the work. Physicians, lawyers, CEOs, there are a lot of people out there like us who have to budget their time carefully. And I think family should not be an excuse for laziness, as it sometimes is. Perceptions are important. And if people perceive that I intend to do as little work as I can get by with, they're not going to be happy with my service. And I've noticed that over the years, people will work for you and with you, but they won't take your place. They won't do your work, but they will help you do it. In fact, I never ask a person to do something for God. I never ask them to do something for the church. I ask them to do something for me. And they're more apt to say yes if you say, I need your help. I need you to do this for me. A preacher whom I greatly respect said that one church where he served, the parsonage was located on a street that many of his members passed going to work. They worked in a factory and they all went by about the same time of day. Now, he was a night person. I'm not a night person. My brain quits at noon. But he didn't get to thinking good till the sun went down. And sometimes he'd be up at midnight working on his sermon. Until one time, one of his members, on the way to work, stopped at the parsonage, and he wasn't out of bed yet. Now he thought, he's never going to understand that I was up at midnight writing that sermon. So the rest of the week, every morning, when his members were driving by to go to the factory, he was out in the yard waving at them as they went by, because he understood that perceptions are very, very important. And if they perceive that you don't really care, it's going to ruin your ministry. I have known ministers who did care, but never communicated that they cared. And it's so important that they perceive that you care. I've got to figure out how to raise this thing. This was obviously intended for a man who was very short. I'm not very good at this sort of thing. I'm getting it. I'm getting it. I'm getting it. You're going to make me feel bad if I don't get it up here. No, no. The second thing I want to talk about is the trap of giftedness. I heard about a preacher, in fact I know him, who said he didn't make hospital calls because he didn't have the gift of compassion. Well, how can he preach if he doesn't have the gift of compassion? If he doesn't have the gift of compassion, he's in the wrong line of work. Jesus beheld the multitudes with compassion. I was told that when Dean Walker was asked to be the president of Milligan College, his father, the more famous W.R. Walker, tried to persuade him not to do it. He said, Dean, you're a teacher. You're not an administrator. You're a teacher. But he came down here and took the job. He had a nice campus and no students, practically. But when he got through, he had a much larger and better campus and hundreds of students working outside of what many would say was his era of giftedness. If you knew Dean Walker, you would say, yes, his gift was teaching. But he worked outside that area of giftedness very, very effectively, and so may we all. We had a lady in the church I served in Florida whose husband was an elder. She was a Sunday school teacher. And then shortly after I left, they asked her to be the church secretary. She said, I never knew how much went on in that church office. And that's true of the people generally that we serve. They really don't know how much we have to do and how many different things we have to do. Now, I think it's good to set goals for yourself or goals for your church, but I want to raise a caution about that. In one college that I know, they had an administrator who was in charge of the student recruiters. And one year, they recruited more new students than had ever been recruited in the history of that school, and he fired them because they didn't meet his goal that he had set for them. We have to be careful about goals. They need to be something that requires a strong effort, but that's also realistic. And I'd rather have a little smaller goal and meet it than a bigger goal and fail to meet it. And that's the problem too with these 5-year plans. You get your 5-year plan. This year we're going to be here, next year there, and next year there. And you may have a wonderful year, but if you miss that target, somebody's going to beat you over the head with it. We didn't meet our plan. We didn't reach our goal. Above all, I think we ought to stop making excuses. I'm tired of hearing people say, that's not in my job description, which a lot of the staff have said in a lot of churches. When Jesus washed the disciples' feet in the upper room, he didn't say, washing feet is not in my job description. When he fed breakfast to the disciples after the resurrection by the sea, he didn't say, cooking breakfast is not in my job description. He didn't say, some of you fellows go over there and get some wood, and some of you go over here and clean the fish. No, he cooked their breakfast, even though it was not a part of what we would describe as his job description. I love the poem, you have it there somewhere, Be Strong. We are not here to play, to dream, to drift. We have hard works and work to do and loads to lift. Shun not the struggle. Face it. 'Tis God's gift. And then the wonderful quotation from a man named Tweedy who said, the daring of Captain Scott in his search for the South Pole, the devotion of Father Damien which brought him to a leper's grave on Molokai, the self-forgetfulness of Arnold Toynbee deserting the cultured fellowship of England's choicest spirits in Oxford to live as a brother and share the lot of the riffraff in London slums, find their match in the daring and devotion and self-forgetfulness of thousands of ministers. These men took up their task not because it was rewarding or easy, but because it needed them, and it was terribly hard. Now I want to begin with some specifics. I want to talk about, first of all, devotional life and how we can keep it fresh. One of the ways I think is to use these new translations, weird translations, offbeat translations. They'll give us new insights, and they'll take a familiar passage and make it come to us with fresh meaning. I love the Book of Common Prayer of the Church of England. Whatever you say about those folks, they knew how to word a prayer. And that will enrich your devotional life. Years ago, I preached at Greenville, Tennessee, when Jess Johnson was at First Christian in Johnson City. And I came over to ask his advice about something, and I got to the church and he wasn't in his study. And I really thought it was probably time he should have been in his study. But I thought, well, while I'm waiting for him to arrive, I'll walk around and look at the building, and I found him. He was in the sanctuary, sitting in a pew, having his morning devotions, and having them by sitting where his people sat. And I thought that was a very wise thing for him to do. I read the other day about a preacher who said that he read the Bible through 40 times every year. He said we ought to be in a position that if anybody asked us about a verse, we could tell them where it was. Well, I don't think we're called to be a walking concordance. They probably got one in the back of their Bible. Let them look it up. He read the Bible through 40 times every year, and I guarantee he didn't understand hardly any of it because I know the man. When I was lecturing over in Europe to preachers from behind the Iron Curtain, and I talked about how much time you spend preparing a sermon, I was asked a question nobody ever asked me before, and it kind of took me back. He said, well, you've told us how much time you spend preparing a sermon. How much time do you spend praying about a sermon? Well, nobody ever asked me that before, and I had to think about it. But I decided it was the same amount of time because all the time I was preparing it, I was praying I'd think of something to put in that sermon. I want to talk about administration. That's one of the roles we have to play. There will be a leader of leaders. Nature abhors a vacuum. If you are not the leader of leaders, somebody will be. Now, it's not somebody that's formally selected or elected or ordained to it. And that person may even deny that he or she is the leader of leaders, but that will be the case. Not formally recognized, but inevitable. Now, you are the best qualified by knowledge, by experience, by disposition, and by the amount of time you spend to be the leader of leaders. And you should do that. But don't mention it. Don't say anything about it to them or anybody else. Never speak of these things. When I had an interim ministry out in California, it didn't start out to be an interim ministry, but it ended up being an interim ministry. I was having some problems, and I went into Los Angeles to the community church in Los Angeles where John Killinger was the preacher. Because I'd had some little contact with John Killinger, I went in and talked to him and told him about the situation. He said, "You're the fifth preacher in 2 weeks who has been in to talk to me about a similar situation, and everyone from a different denomination. I said, John, sometimes I think most of these problems in our churches are about power. He said, no, you're wrong. All of them are. I think maybe he's right, as I've thought about it since. If you challenge somebody's power, then they feel threatened. And so you have to be very careful in your use of power. An elder in England said to me, if your church grows too fast, you lose control. Nobody ever was that frank with me before, but I think people sense that somehow. And if they think you're trying to seize power, you're going to be in trouble. On the other hand, they will give you power. Not formally, not intentionally, but as they learn to trust you, they will give you more and more power, and you'll have more and more leeway. But this thing happens under the surface, sub rosa. Never overestimate your power. Because sometimes when a preacher is very popular, he thinks that translates into power. And I knew a preacher in the church that my sister belongs to. He was very popular. And the music minister was under fire. Imagine that. The music minister was under fire. And he said to his leaders, if you let him go, I'm going to. And they let him go. And he went too. Because he overestimated his power. He thought they would say, oh, no, we can't stand for you to go. Our church won't survive if you go. We'll keep this guy that we don't like just to keep. That didn't happen. Well, after he saw it wasn't going to happen, he went back and asked him if he could reconsider his resignation. And they said yes. But he said it's only under the following conditions. And this and that and this and that. And they declined his offer. So don't overestimate the amount of power you have. And of course, never threaten to resign. Never, ever, ever threaten to resign. And a new minister going into a church and his leaders always reminds me of two wrestlers. Have you ever noticed two wrestlers in the ring, how they sort of size each other up and they walk around in circles and they look at each other? And that happens in a new ministry. As the leaders size you up and you size them up, but when they can find that you can be trusted, they will unconsciously give you more power. And I've had some interesting examples of administration, good and bad. Palmer Young, who was the minister of First Christian in Kingsport, was a master at administration. He would be going somewhere to a men's meeting or something, riding a car with some of his leaders, and he would say, you know what we ought to think about doing? We ought to think about. And he said 2 months later, somebody would stand up in a board meeting and say, I have an idea. I suggest that we do this. And Palmer would sit in the back of the room and try not to smile when that was presented. You see things as an administrator that others don't see. I know a church that it fronts on a major street, and behind it is a very minor street, just a few blocks long. But for years they gave the minor street as their church address, which nobody knew, and didn't give the major street, which is in front of the church, that everybody in town knew. Now, I never could figure out why nobody saw that until a preacher came and said, wait a minute, we're using the wrong address. When Wayne Smith started preaching, he preached for our little country church in my home county. And at the first board meeting, he said, I hate to complain the first board meeting, but could we put a knob on that front door? And my cousin, Gene Ogden, said, what are you talking about? Wayne said, there's no knob on the front door. There's just a nail stuck through a hole in the shaft. Gene Ogden said, I open that door every Sunday morning, and there is a knob on that door. And Wayne Smith said there is not a knob on that door. There is just a nail stuck through a hole in the shaft. They had to adjourn the board meeting to go and see. Because what people see all the time, they don't see at all. At the Broadway Christian Church in Lexington, Kentucky, they were talking about their parking problem. And one man said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "We don't have a parking problem." He said, "Every Sunday, I turn off of Broadway onto this side street. I turn onto the alley behind the church. Then I turn right onto the next alley, and I always get a parking spot." It never occurred to him that a visitor might not know to turn on the side street, turn left on the alley, and turn right on the next alley. It just never occurred to him. But you see things. As the preacher, you see things that others don't see. And one more thing on administration. Well, two or three. I don't believe in asking for volunteers. You ask for volunteers for the nursery. You might get somebody volunteering that should not be in a nursery. These are strange times in which we live. You ask for volunteers to go visiting. Somebody might volunteer that you don't want out there representing your church. So I think that's a great mistake. As an administrator, answer your mail the day you get it. That was the thing I admired about Palmer Young. He might answer it on the bottom of your letter, but the day he got your letter, he answered it. And I think that's important. When you are new in a place, change something immediately. Something little. Doesn't have to be something big. Small but visible. Maybe it's the color of the Sunday bulletin or the layout of the newsletter or a little bit of change in the order of worship or something on the outside of the appearance of the church. But immediately it signals this is a new administration. We got a new leader here. And then I think you should delegate, but don't abdicate. And there's an enormous difference between the two. I went to preach in a church once. Before the service, I couldn't find the preacher. I looked everywhere, and I found him down in the basement filling the communion cups. Now, that's wrong. There are people in his church who can't do anything else, who would be thrilled to have the opportunity to fill the communion cups. And the preacher's down there doing it, and he shouldn't do that. Not that he's too good to do it. I understand that. I'm not the janitor of the church, and I'm not too good to be a janitor. I was a janitor of a church once. I was a janitor of a school once. I'm not too good to be a janitor. But if a church hires me to preach and makes me the janitor, they got the most overpaid janitor in town. And there are people who would be delighted to have the responsibility to open, to close, to prepare the communion. And then I think bird dog your committees. Don't appoint a committee and then fuss because they never met and they never got anything done. No. Work with your committees. The man who ran our stewardship program in Orlando, Florida, ran it from the sidewalk in front of the church. And he would wait for somebody to come out who was the chairman of a committee, and he'd sidle up to him and said, how's your committee going? You need any help? Is there any way I can help you? Will you be able to get it done by a certain date? And he ran every one of his stewardship committees standing in front of the church. He didn't just give them a job and go off and forget about it. But he regulated and was the overseer of what they did. My home church, every time they get a new preacher, I know what he's going to say. In my home county, they have 2 pages of church notes. And most of it is what their preacher said last Sunday. And in my home church, every time they get a new preacher, it's the same thing. You people go out there and win somebody to Jesus. You go out there and win somebody. And that's no way to delegate. The way to delegate is to tell them where to go, when to go, and what to say when they get there. That's the way you get people to win somebody to Christ. That's the way you get visitors. Well, all of this board is up here just for one single thing that I think is very, very important. In your church, you will have leaders and you will have workers. And you will notice that those two circles are not identical. That's a mistake we make. We have wonderful leaders who will never be good workers. And we have wonderful workers who will never be leaders. So these two groups overlap, but they're not identical. And I know so many preachers who are frustrated because their elders are not all over here in the worker circle. And there are people that you need in leadership who you don't need out visiting, you don't need teaching Sunday school, you don't need in some other capacity, but you do need them in that leadership role. And you can save yourself a lot of frustration if you recognize the difference in those two groups. They overlap, but they're not identical. Well, I want to talk about sermon preparation, which is my favorite subject. Some preachers block off time when they are undisturbed to prepare their sermons. I was never comfortable with that. I thought that person who comes in the office without an appointment is paying my salary. And if he wants to see me, he can see me. You can turn creativity on and off. We always think we can't. If we don't have 2 hours, we can't be creative. I don't believe that's true. I think you can turn it off when somebody comes in and interrupts you and turn it back on when the person leaves. Recently, in his column in the Christian Standard, Paul Williams was beating himself up because he only spent 17 hours preparing a sermon. Well, now you know right away Paul Williams is not serving a local church. Nobody who is serving a local church can spend 17 hours preparing a sermon. In fact, if you can't do it in 6 or 8 hours, you're in the wrong line of work. And he quoted some writer who he said took 105 hours of research for every 6 pages she wrote in her book. Well, we are not dealing with material that is unfamiliar. We are somewhat familiar with the material from which we're going to draw our sermons. And I think to talk about spending 17 hours on one sermon is unrealistic and unnecessary. There is such a thing as over-preparation. And you can see it every time you go to one of our conventions. Because the man gets that assignment way ahead of time. And he prepares and over-prepares, and he preaches too long, and he goes down too deep. One thing you can do with sermon preparation is a double use of your time. When I say 6 to 8 hours, I'm talking about that's time spent exclusively preparing your sermon. But now there are tag-ins of time that we can use. You're going to the hospital to make calls. Well, you don't have to think to drive. We drive automatically. So while you're driving to the hospital, you can think creatively about your sermon. You go to the dentist, you never get into the time your appointment is. Instead of reading a year-old magazine, you can sit there and think about your sermon. Somebody's late for an appointment. You can sit there and think creatively about your sermon and reflect on it. Even when you're doing counseling or visitation, that sermon is there in the back of your head, sort of fermenting. And sometimes there is a symbiotic relationship between the other roles we play and sermon preparation. Sometimes they work together. Now, sometimes they don't. I understand that. When I get a prescription at the drugstore, they always give me this paper, and it lists all the side effects. I always read that. I want all the side effects I'm entitled to. I paid a lot for that medicine, and if I can get that side effect, that's what I want. But sometimes it will say, if you're taking this, don't take that, because there is a negative interaction. And I've seen that happen a few times, one of which I will refer to in a moment. People don't understand what it takes to come up with a sermon. Because I preached for many years without notes, some people thought I didn't prepare my sermon, that I just got up and started talking. And you know, if you're going to preach without notes, you got to prepare it with more pain and care and spend a little more time on it and energy on it than you otherwise would. There are other roles that we can fill from the pulpit, such as administration. There are things that we are doing in the church that have to be dealt with from the pulpit. And by the way, you have to make announcements. I know announcements are terrible. Everybody hates announcements. You can't run a church without announcements. You do a little group counseling sometimes from the pulpit, little group therapy. Evangelism, pastoral care. All of these things indirectly, don't call names, indirectly can be dealt with from the pulpit. The great English preacher D.W.C. Ford said, "The insoluble dilemma of the preacher is that without a congregation, there's no one to preach to. And with a congregation, there's no time to prepare to preach." That is, he said, an insoluble dilemma. And that's been my experience. I want to talk a little bit about evangelism and church growth. My minister's here, so I have to be careful, but someone in his church, not his idea, came up with this idea that during the month of May, people would bring a visitor, the same visitor, every one of the 5 Sundays in May. And so it was announced that everybody's to bring a visitor for all 5 Sundays in May. He and I think one person did it because there was no plan. You don't just throw something out and hope it's going to happen. For one thing, anything that you want to happen has to be announced 3 Sundays in advance. Second, it has to be advertised 3 different ways. You maybe put it in the newsletter or the bulletin or have a poster contest or a theme song. But the rule of 3 Sundays beforehand in a row and 3 different ways. And then have people you have asked to do the task. Would you do this? Would you do that? Would you be a part of this group or committee? And then you follow up on each one as time goes by. That's the only way any plan will ever work for evangelism or church growth. Now, if everyone is a soul winner, then I'm a soul winner. And you're a soul winner. But we are confronted in our churches with the Amway syndrome. Are you familiar with Amway? First of all, you're in business for yourself. So that way when you can't sell the product, you've got the garage full of it and you're stuck with it. But nobody wants to sell Amway. Everybody wants to be a distributor of Amway. So I get you to be a salesman and you to be a salesman and you to be a salesman, and then you sell the product and I just sit back and distribute it. But you don't want to be a salesman. You want to be a distributor. So you get 3 salespeople or 4 or 5 and you become a distributor. And suddenly you realize nobody's selling the product. Now that Amway syndrome comes into the church. Everybody wants people to be won to Christ, but nobody wants to be a soul winner. Nobody wants to go out there and talk to people about what they need to do. Bill Mayfield, who used to preach at First Christian Church in Elizabethton, Bill Mayfield said, when you walk in somebody's home and your seat hits the seat in the living room, talk about what you came for. He left a thriving ministry in Florida and came to Elizabethton. And I thought, I know Carter County, Tennessee. There are not 2 prospects in all of Carter County, Tennessee. The first year Bill Mayfield was at Elizabethton, they had 60 additions because he had this great heart for evangelism. I tried it in this brief ministry in California. You know, you say, well, everybody works. Everybody works. Well, certainly in California, everybody works. So I visited from 4 to 9 each evening for 4 nights. My wife gave me a sandwich. I ate in the car going from one house to another. And from 4 to 9, I found people at home. If I didn't find them at 7 o'clock, I doubled back at 8 o'clock to see if they'd gotten home yet. I rang 1,000 doorbells in 1 year in Huntington Beach, California. We can do evangelism if we are determined to do it. Now, I think the evangelistic call, like all calls, should not be too long. And when you get ready to leave, leave. Have you ever had somebody who was a guest at your house and they said, well, we got to go, and they just sat there? After a while, they stood up and said, well, we got to go, but they didn't go. Got as far as the door, well, we got to go. And you knew they wanted to leave. And you wanted them to leave, but they didn't know how to leave. Sort of like some sermons you have heard. Haven't you? You've heard a sermon where you knew the preacher wanted to quit. And you wanted him to quit. But he didn't know how to quit because he hadn't written his conclusion. So, go for the reason you came, and when it's time to leave, leave. Now, I know this culture. I know it very well. And the minute you get up to leave, people say, oh, don't go, you just got here. That's pro forma. That's courtesy. That doesn't mean a thing. I knew a preacher who came into this area, and every time he got up to leave, they said, don't go, you just got here. And he'd sit back down. He might make one call in an entire evening. So you determine the length of the call. You know what you came for, what you have to do, how long it takes to do it. When it's time to go, go. If you have not read Callahan's book, 12 Keys to an Effective Church, you must. 12 Keys to an Effective Church. Notice he doesn't say the biggest church in the country, but an effective church. When I read that book, I saw every mistake I ever made in a lifetime in the ministry. They were all there. One of the things he said was, a layperson makes the first call on visitors. Not you, but somebody in the church. And they make it Monday or at the very latest Tuesday after they visited on Sunday. Then if the people come back a second time, then you make the second call. I didn't know that when I had this interim ministry in California. And I had the people give me the visitor cards of the first-time visitors when I walked out after the second service on Sunday. Sunday afternoon, I was knocking on their door. That was a mistake. First of all, it made me look too eager. Like they must really have a hard time getting members if they're pouncing on me this quickly. And he's paid to do it. The lay person is not. And that was a big mistake. Now, my personal experience in evangelistic calling is I have to force myself to make the first 3 calls. After that, the day's too short. After that, I'm ready to go. My steam is up. But the first 3 calls, I have to force myself to make. After that, it's easy. Always start with your best prospect. I did the opposite. I thought, well, these really good prospects will probably come in automatically anyway, so I'll go out here and work with these unlikely prospects, and then we'll have more additions because the unlikely ones and the likely ones. And of course, I lost on both counts. So always visit your best prospect first. And know how to close the sale. There are 4 words. 4 words, the magic words to close the sale. And we taught this to our members who were calling. We had some, when I was in Florida, we had some very intensive evangelistic efforts. And we taught our members how to do this. And it's very simple. You just present the thing and then say, will you do it? And when you ask, will you do it, you wait for an answer. One place, I went in and I said, will you do it? And he didn't say anything. I didn't say anything. I must have sat there 10 minutes. Finally he said, Yes. If he hadn't answered me, I'd be sitting there tonight. I ask him a question. I'm not going to say anything till he answers it. Now, here's where the problem comes in when you got this dear wife who comes to church every Sunday, and the minute you say, will you do it, she gets him off the hook. But, well, I've been trying to get him to do it for 20 years. And that's why you got to have somebody calling with you sometimes to get her out of the picture, get her out of the question. And then we taught them to come back to that same question 3 times. If they didn't get a yes the first time, talk a while, come back again. And whatever reason they gave for not doing it, to say, well, that's the very reason you ought to do it. And 9 times out of 10, you can make that stick. Well, I don't know how long we're going to be here. That's the very reason you ought to do it. We don't even know how long we're going to be on earth. Life is very uncertain. And you need to do it now. Will you do it? Back to the question again. And of course, the classic one is, I want to think about it. Well, of course, it's a thoughtful decision. But my guess is you've probably been thinking about it. And we've thought about it together here tonight. So the real question is, will you do it? Now, I told this to some of my students at Atlanta Christian College. And one student said, isn't that putting on a lot of pressure? And I said, yeah. If you believe that people are lost, it makes all the difference. If you believe people are lost, it's time to, as Paul says, persuade men. And I think if you do it in a charming and pleasant way, I think you'll find it works. My experience has been the easier they are to win, the easier they are to lose. And the harder they are to win, the harder they are to lose. And now this is outside my area of giftedness, frankly. I prefer to be in the pulpit preaching. But I've found out I could do it and do it with great results, and so can you. And evangelism has got to be the keynote of what we do. Evangelistic calling lifts your spirits. Things are coming unglued at church. Half the people are mad at you. You go out and visit some of your new visitors, and they'll tell you why that's the greatest church in the world, and you're the best preacher since Billy Graham, maybe even better than Billy Graham, and it'll lift your spirits. I knew a county school superintendent who said to me, every time I have a problem I can't solve, I leave the office and I go out and visit my schools. Now, I forget about the problem. I just visit my schools. And he said, every time when I get back to the office, I have the solution to the problem. Lawrence Welk, as you know, has been revived and is still on the on the television. And they have a little interview time with people who have been on the show. And the presenter asked this one lady, what did you learn from Lawrence Welk? She said, I learned to love the audience. That's it. Whether you're preaching or whatever you're doing, you learn to love the audience. And I can tell you, it's no fun to preach to strangers. I've preached to strangers. And it's no fun. It's just a sea of faces out there. But in my own pulpit, when I have stood with these people in the hospital room or by the bedside or perhaps in a funeral home or by the graveside or in some other situation, and I know them, and I know their struggles, and they know me, that's the thing that really makes preaching come alive. And then don't let problems dampen your evangelism. A preacher I know said recently to a person in his church, I couldn't ask anybody to come to this church. It's the church he's serving. But things had come unglued, and he said, I couldn't ask anybody to come to this church. Well, let me tell you something. When Reggie Thomas was at Catlin, Illinois, they were having a great evangelistic program. They had worked for 3 months on this evangelistic program. And they were having services every night. And every night there was a lady standing at the door with a petition to fire the preacher and asking people as they came in or went out to sign her petition to fire Reggie Thomas. Now anybody else would have closed down the meeting, but they didn't close down the meeting, and they had 65 additions in that week under those conditions. So don't let any problems dampen your enthusiasm for evangelism. If you strike a thorn or rose, keep it going. If it hails or if it snows, keep it going. Tain't no use to sit and whine if the fish ain't on your line. Bait your hook and keep a trying. Keep a going. Let's take a break. Well, he brought something to my mind that wasn't in my notes, but I think I probably ought to include it because I was talking to the head elder in one of our little churches here in the county, and he said, "What do they teach those students up at Emmanuel?" He said, "They come in here, they don't speak to anybody. They preach the sermon. When it's over, they stand with their back to the congregation." He said if anybody came forward, he'd have to tap them on the shoulder. Well, I thought he had an interesting point. One of the mistakes I made was that before the morning service, I hid out because somebody was always coming up and saying, "You know, Mrs. Brown's mad because she was sick and you didn't come to see her." And it's hard to preach after that. But I should not have done it. I should have worked the room. And now, when I go anywhere to preach, when I get there, I work the room. And when you finish preaching, look like you really expect somebody might respond. Even if you don't, if you know everybody in there, you still have this air of expectancy. I knew an evangelist who was the best person at extending the invitation that I've ever heard. I was never very good at extending the invitation. But George Stansbury was so good at extending the invitation. People would sit out there and wish they hadn't joined before so they could go forward that night. But I do think when you finish your sermon, don't stand with your back to the crowd looking at the screen. If you don't know the song, just hum it. And look as if you really are expecting that somebody out there is going to respond. I hadn't planned to put that in, but when John was talking about one of his first efforts, it came to my mind. There needs to be a certain persistence in evangelism. In one of my early ministries, there was a man in the neighborhood, a couple in the neighborhood that I visited, and they said, "Yeah, we're going to come up there to your church," but they never did. So I went back, yeah, we're going to come up there, but they never did. And after about 5 or 6 visits, I was going down in that part of the area, and I told my wife, "Tommy Wilhoit and his wife have lied to me for the last time. I am sick and tired of them lying to me." Well, I got down there and I thought, why should I be embarrassed? They're the ones who should be embarrassed. I'm going to go one more time. So I went one more time. I got the same promise. The next Sunday morning, I looked out the bedroom window of the parsonage and I saw Tommy Wilhoit parking in front of the church. He became a deacon. She became a member of the choir. I was sure glad that I went back one more time. When I preached at Greenville, one of our members said, "Nice fella moved in next door to us here. He doesn't go anywhere to church. Why don't you go over and invite him?" So I went over and invited him. He didn't come. I went back and invited him again. He didn't come. I went back and invited him again. He didn't come. After about the 6th time, he did start coming to our church, became a member of our church. We put him on the visitation team the next time we had a visitation program. And I remember him saying, "Is this the only way we can get people to go to our church?" And he forgot that I'd been in his house 6 times before he was ever inside the church. Now let me tell you the classic one. Bob Richards was one of our fine preachers. Last ministry was in Huntington, West Virginia. And he told me this story. He said, I didn't grow up in a church-going family. And he said, my parents owned a dry cleaner in Orlando, Florida. And there was a man in First Christian Church named A.K. Henderson. And he said every Monday he left his dry cleaning at our dry cleaning establishment. And every Saturday he picked it up. And every Saturday he said, I want to invite you up to First Christian Church. I said, we didn't go. He said he did that every Saturday for a year. And then he said one Sunday my mother took my sister and me to Sunday school. And he said I sat down by a boy and he said, we're having a contest. Will you come back next Sunday and count for me? And he said, well, if my mother will let me, I will. He said, I always believed in contests. So for several months, the mother and the daughter and the son went to church. Then he said one Sunday, his father came down dressed for church. And he went with them. He said, after that, my father did not miss a Sunday for 25 years. He became the treasurer of the church. And Bob Richards became a preacher. And I'm so glad A.K. Henderson didn't quit inviting after the second time, or the third time, or the fourth time. He just kept inviting. And that's the real secret of evangelism. Don't give up. As long as they don't get mad at you or join the Baptist church, keep on them. Now, I want to say something about pastoral care and counseling. Years ago, there was a man in Wales named Lord Colby who was going on a bear hunting trip to Siberia. He'd be gone a whole year. His wife said, would it be all right if I made a few changes here in the house while you were gone? And he said it would. So while he was gone, she built an addition onto the house, put a terrace out in front of it. When Lord Colby got back, he didn't even recognize his own house. Now, something like that happened to me. I went to the mission field, stayed a year. When I came back, I didn't recognize my own church. In the first place, some of the churches weren't even called church anymore. They were just Journey or Generation or something. Nobody had a church secretary. They were all administrative assistants. And when I left, we were all ministers. And when I got back, we were all pastors. That doesn't bother me. That's all right. I don't mind being a pastor. What puzzles me is, though, how did it happen so quickly and so universally? Something else puzzles me. At the time we decided to call ourselves pastors, some of us decided to quit doing pastoral work. It's like saying I'm a doctor, but I'm not going to treat patients. I'm a teacher, but don't bring me any students. It just amazes me. And I put pastoral care and counseling together because counseling is a form of pastoral care. There is a book out called Competent to Counsel. It says that all your church, don't write it down. Don't write that down. I don't like that book. I disagree with that book. If the average member of the church is competent to counsel, some people are wasting a lot of money studying counseling. They go for years to study counseling. You can get a degree in it. And then somebody writes this book that, anybody in the church is competent to counsel. I had experience of a person in my church who went to a member of the church for counseling and then went out and tried to kill himself. Fortunately, he didn't do any better at that than he did anything else. He couldn't do anything right, and he failed at that as well. But I don't believe just anybody is competent to counsel. Now, it was a great relief to me to find that there was such a thing as non-directive counseling, because I thought I had to solve everybody's problems. And I took a course in counseling at a Lutheran seminary, and they talked about non-directive counseling, and I said, that's it. How do you feel about that? That worked a lot better for me. But let me tell you, One, counseling takes an awful lot of time. Huge amounts of time devoted to one individual. I held a revival not very far from here, and the preacher was really interested in counseling, and he was working with some alcoholic guy all week long, and he and I may have made 2 visits because the rest of the time he was tied up with this alcoholic. And I think your counseling should only be first aid. I'll tell you why. If you go into extended counseling with somebody, and you really go in deep, they'll leave your church. Nobody is going to sit out there and listen to somebody preach who knows their darkest secrets. They won't stay. I always followed the policy of going with my sermon plan. I planned a year's sermons in advance, and I always tried to follow the plan. But one time, I had a man come in, and he was so messed up. He was an active member of my church. He came in and said, well, I wouldn't be here if you hadn't smoked me out Sunday night. He said, when you were talking about that wolf in sheep's clothing, I knew you meant me. Well, of course, I didn't mean him. And he finally went to a competent counselor. But listening to him, I suddenly realized, if I preach the sermon I've planned for next Sunday, it will blow him out of the water. And I changed my sermon because of what I had learned from him. So I think I'm not a fan of counseling. You may have gathered that by now. We have to do some of it, but you get too involved and it doesn't work. Now I want to talk about pastoral care in terms of visitation. Getting to know the people in your church. Now, I know you can't build a church visiting shut-ins. I know that. But people who have borne the burden and heat of the day deserve not to be ignored when they get old and they can't get around much anymore. And mere Christian charity suggests that we should not ignore them. I think you should do hospital visitation. I held a revival church down in Florida. Not a very big church. The preacher said, well, I don't do any hospital visiting. My elders do all the hospital visiting. I said, well, I think you're making a mistake. I think that interchange with you and the sick person is valuable to you as well as to them. A year later, I got a letter from him. He said, I have started making hospital visits, and I think I'm preaching better sermons. Well, of course he was. Besides the fact that 1,000 years of tradition have led people to expect that the person who stands in front of them on Sunday will stand beside them when they are sick. And it's not time consuming unless they're way off somewhere in Winston-Salem or Charlotte or something. It's a good use of your time. Normally, a hospital visit, 10 minutes. And I never sit down unless we're going to have a really long, extended visit. Now, once in a while, there will be somebody who's dying, and he knows he's dying, and he wants to talk about it. And the family won't let him talk about it. Oh, Daddy, don't talk like that. He needs to talk to somebody. Then I sit down, and I let him talk. And I feel like when I leave, boy, I earned my money today. Because it's hard to sit there and listen to somebody talking about his own demise. But that's rare. I don't sit down. Oh, they always say, oh, sit down, sit down. No, I just stand. 10 minutes would be the average hospital visit. And I learned something from one of our Florida preachers, Bob Coleman, who said that there was a lady in the church who was terminally ill. But the family said to him, don't tell her. If you tell her, she'll give up. Don't tell her. He walked in the hospital room and she said, Brother Bob, am I going to get well? And he said, now you've known me a long time. You know I'm not a doctor. What a great answer. She didn't ask him if he were a doctor. But what a great answer. He met the wishes of the family. He didn't lie to her. It was just a perfect answer. Now, I think you should have ahead of time your hospital visitation policy. already in place so that you don't visit your friends more than your enemies. And our policy was, in the local hospitals, you were visited every other day unless you were critical. And then we went every day. Now, of course, if he's critical and he's in the hospital, I'm not going to pass him up when I go to see him, so he'll get visited every day, though he's not critical. But in a normal situation, every other day. Out of town, once a week. Maybe twice, but probably not. Shut-ins, once a month. As I've already indicated, the time you spend driving, you can use to other things. Prepare your sermons. If death comes, drop everything and go. Now, whatever you're doing, drop it and go. And do not wonder about what you will say. You don't have to say anything. It's the fact that you're there. We had a young man in his 40s drop dead with a heart attack. I went over to the house. I walked in. And his wife said, "Okay, Bob, let's hear those comforting words you have for a time like this." What a challenge. And I said, "Barbara, I don't have any." Because nothing that I said would have comforted her at that point. It was the fact that I was there. And when you go to the funeral home where somebody's died, go to the person nearest to the deceased and walk up and put your arm around them. And if you want to say anything, say, "This is terrible." Because it is always terrible. We had a lady in our church whose mother died from cancer at 85 years old. And she said to me, "People keep saying my mother's better off, but then she's not their mother, is she?" And so I never say, "Well, this person's better off." Death is always terrible to those who are left. Personally, I don't let them plan the funeral unless I can help it. I've done a lot of funerals. I know a lot more about funerals than they do. Now, sometimes they will voluntarily say, "Well, I want this, or I want that, or I want something else." And of course, whatever they want, that's fine. But normally, I do the funeral. I've done hundreds of funerals. I know how to do a funeral. I think it should be short. Let's don't prolong the person's grief. And I think a post-bereavement visit is necessary and useful. Pastoral care informs preaching indirectly, not directly. You don't quote what people said in the nursing home or in the funeral home or anywhere else. You don't quote them directly. If you do have a really good quote, then you say, "One of our dear members said to me." That's all. You don't have to say who it is. Shouldn't say who it is. After all, visitors don't even know who that person is anyway. So it's lost on them. But I think rarely you will quote anything from visiting or counseling. We sing the song, "Does Jesus Care?" But what people want to know is, do you care? And I knew a preacher who really did care, but he never communicated it. And his people never found out that he cared. And they want to know, do you really care? So it's been well said that every sermon should have somewhere a note of comfort, because in every pew there's a broken heart. I had a 5-year interim ministry in Carter County at the Oak Grove Christian Church, which I think was maybe not a record, but awfully close. But I sat up there one Sunday, and I like to sit on a platform. I like the chief seats in a synagogue. And there's a reason. I want them to get used to looking at me, which takes a while, and I want to get used to looking at them before it's time to preach. I don't want to jump up out of the pew like I just happened to wander in and sit on the front row, and people say, "Where did he get that shirt? Where did he get that awful tie?" Let them get used to that before it's time to preach. And I was sitting up there in the chief seat in the synagogue, and I looked out over these people, and You know, I'd been there over 4 years. And I thought, there is a broken heart in every pew. By that time, I could name it. With this, it's their children disappointed them. With these, it's an unexpected divorce. With these, it's an incurable illness. With these, I could look around, and every single one. There was not one person in that little sanctuary that did not have a broken heart over something. And so every sermon should have a note of comfort. I bet this story is not true, but it's a great story. About the little Methodist church, the bishop sent him a young preacher, and at the end of the year, the head steward called the bishop up and said, "You got to get us a different preacher." He said, "Every Sunday this preacher stands up and tells us we're all going to hell." So the bishop sent him an old preacher. And a year passed, and the head steward called him up and he said, "You got to get us a different preacher." He said, "Every Sunday he tells us we're going to hell." So he sent a middle-aged preacher. A year passed and he waited for his phone call and it didn't come. And after a while he called up the chief steward and said, "How do you like your preacher?" He said, "We like him." He said, "I guess he doesn't tell you every Sunday you're going to hell." He said, "Oh yes. Every Sunday he tells us we're going to hell, but he cries when he says it." That's the secret of letting people know that you really, really care. And that we're not in this job to see how little work we can get by with, but how much we can do. When you think about life and time, they're the same thing. Time's only the way we measure life. And the only way you can give your life to Jesus is to give Him your time. And I got a little poem that I put in your thing. Work. Thank God for the ring of it, the hammering, clamoring swing of it. Labor of man daily hurled on the mighty anvils of the world. Thank God for a world where none may shirk. Thank God for the splendor of work. Now, I've been informed that we are to have a question period. I have my preacher with me. My pastor with me. And he will answer all of the questions after I repeat them for the tape.
Do you have a concern, your greatest concern with preaching today?
My greatest concern with preaching today is that it may not be very helpful and it may not be very interesting. I think it's generally probably biblical, but a lot of people sit through an awful lot of dull sermons. And that's probably my greatest concern about preaching today, that I don't find it always helpful and I don't find it always interesting when I visit other churches. In my home church, it is always helpful and it is always interesting.
When you say helpful, what do you mean? In what kind of ways?
Okay. I don't think we go in the pulpit to explain a passage. We go in the pulpit to explain life. But fortunately, for every problem in life, there is something in the Bible that addresses it. Now, I said that once and I was quoted and misapplied because I think the preacher was trying to defend his preaching sanctified psychology. And I don't mean sanctified psychology. But I do mean people are coming to church thinking, I hope I can find something that'll let me hold on another week. And I want to give them something that will help them to hold on another week. And so that's where I think we need to be sensitive to people's needs and to find in personages in the Bible, in something that Jesus said or did, or in some verse in the Bible, something that will address this need. I went to fill in one Sunday in a little church in Johnson County, and I got there early, and there was one person already there. And she's sitting on the back row. And I said, well, you're early. Well, she said, this is the only place I can get any rest. And I thought she meant that she had a problem with her back, and the curvature of the pew was comfortable. But as we talked, that wasn't what she meant at all. Because she was coming from a family situation and a home situation that was more than stressful. And when she got to church, she got a little rest. Now, what am I going to say that's going to address her? I was in a church, I always like to sit in the back when I visit. I was in a church somewhere, Cock County, I think it was. I sat in the back, and in front of me, there sat a man with no legs. Both of his legs had been amputated. And the preacher preached on Jesus healing the blind man. And I kept waiting for him to say something that might in some way comfort that man sitting in front of me. But he never did. And I know that's not easy to do. But on the other hand, I thought he should have tried.
You mentioned about planning your sermons a year in advance and in your rhythm. Could you talk a little bit about how you physically plan that out? Did you contribute things to file folders or something as the year would progress so that when the Sunday came for that particular sermon to be prepared, you'd have a file with various things in it? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I'd be glad to talk about that. I started doing that when I discovered that I was preaching altogether from the letters, from the epistles, and you know why. That just lends itself to sermon outline. Just sort of break it out, it's right there. And I wanted to preach from the Gospels in the Old Testament. So in Florida, you had a little slack time in the summer. Everybody who could afford to went north. So I had a little more time. So in the summer, I planned my preaching for the next calendar year. But I could only do that because all year long, whenever I got an idea, I wrote it down, threw it in a drawer. Might be a text, might be a topic, something. And so when I got ready, I just emptied that drawer and I had a whole lot of ideas here. For me, it was useful to do series. 4, maybe 6. Now, I didn't like to do more than 6, which is a little tough if you're preaching on the 10 Commandments. But then some of my members didn't use all the commandments anyway. But normally, I liked a series about 4, 5 weeks long. So I would try then to get a spin-off idea. I ran across a little book called The Silences of Jesus. The silent years, when he stood before Herod and wouldn't say anything. And I thought, yeah. And then there are the hard sayings of Jesus. And then there are the verily, verily sayings of Jesus. So I had 3 months suddenly of preaching lined out. The silences of Jesus, the hard sayings of Jesus. If you don't hate father and mother, you can't follow me. Let the dead bury their dead. And then the verily, verilies. Now, not all of these series did I announce. If I thought it had a little value, I would. The verily, verilies, I had a problem with that because what are you going to call them? The verities of Jesus? That's not a word we often use. But then I found out when Jesus said that, he said, Amen, Amen. So here was a series on the Amens of Jesus. So gradually this thing came together and then shifted it around to fit the church year. Because you've got to address at least Christmas and Easter and probably the 4th of July. I don't see how you can do the 4th of July, Veterans Day, and Armistice Day or whatever it is. I don't think you can do 3 of them, but I felt I maybe ought to do one, bow once to jingoism. And so work this around to fit the church year. Then I had a checklist by which I measured these sermons. 1, am I preaching from all parts of the Bible? From the Old Testament, from the Gospels, not always from Acts, but every other year from Acts, from the epistles, and maybe every other year from the book of Revelation. Then the second test was, am I doing all kinds of sermons? Am I doing some expository sermons, some biographical sermons, some topical sermons? The third test was, am I doing evangelistic sermons, teaching sermons, comforting sermons, doctrinal sermons? And I tried to have the doctrinal ones in the winter when we had all those visitors from the north down there, so at least when they went home they knew what a Christian church was all about. Now, when I got this list ready, then I waited until the funeral home gave me this lovely appointment book. My people didn't make appointments. So for every Sunday in that book, I wrote the text or topic, maybe both, of what I was going to do that Sunday. Then I had 5 more pages. So if in July I got an idea for Christmas, I could just turn over there and write it in. Or if I clip something out of the newspaper in December that will work fine for Labor Day, I just cut it out and put it in. And my book got thicker and thicker and thicker as the year went by. And then it was wonderful on Monday morning to go in and open that book. There's my text, there's my topic, there's 2 or 3 ideas written down, there are a couple of clippings I might use. I had already started before I started, and that was a great blessing to me. That worked for me. Now, of course, the plan served me, I didn't serve the plan. And if I wanted to abandon it, I abandoned it. But I rarely did that. What if something comes up in the life of the church? Well, maybe I've got a sermon down the line in 2 or 3 months that will address that. And if I wait till then, I won't be so mad, and I will preach more sanely than if I attack on Sunday the lousy board meeting we had on Tuesday night. So it was useful to me to be a little bit restrained by the plan. But that really worked for me, and it avoided the panic of walking in there on Monday morning and say, what in the world am I going to preach about Sunday? We have just a few more minutes. I see the man in the back.
Let me make a comment. You was talking about the visitation, and I told you my experience was as a salesman. And cold calling was kind of my forte. I know one time I made 34 calls on a lady before she ever bought anything. And I told that. And the comment in the back of the room was, "Believe it, changed mouthwash."
Did you hear that? He made 34 calls on the same prospect before she bought anything.
And I think, sometimes we think we need our mouthwash changed or a haircut or something, but just keep plodding.
And as one of our preachers said, no doesn't mean never. No doesn't mean never.
Did you ever, over the course of your preaching ministry, ask certain individuals, maybe elders or other persons that you felt would be appropriate, helpful, to purposely provide you with feedback or evaluation or critique of your sermons to help you grow as a preacher?
Absolutely not. When it's over, it's over. If they didn't like last Sunday, maybe they'll like next Sunday. Now, I did once ask people to suggest a topic or text, one that they would like to hear a sermon preached on, or that they thought our church needed a sermon preached on, or that they needed a sermon preached on. And the results I got from that were abysmal. They were not worth the paper I got back. It was not helpful to me at all. So my answer is no. No, I don't want any feedback. But because I try to have a lot of eye contact, I really get feedback the whole time I'm preaching, because I can see people looking disturbed, amazed, whatever, angry, nonplussed, whatever that means. But no, and funny thing happened talking about that evaluation. They had this thing one time where I was supposed to do a self-evaluation, What are your strong points? What are your weak points? And I'd been really busy. And I don't think I'm preaching as well as I did last year. The next year, when they evaluated me, one of the elders put down, he's not preaching as well as he used to be. Well, he didn't know. He just copied what I wrote down. If I ever do that again, and they say, what is your weak point? I'm going to put down, I tend to work too hard. Let's see what to do with that one. Yes.
In a culture where biblical literacy continues to be all-time high, the average worship attendee is something like 1.4 times a month of all attendees in our country. And people are reticent to become actively involved, and that's not, I mean, there's a lot of hesitation more and more, I think, in our culture. How does that change how we preach, if any?
Well, I think there were congregations that you could refer to Bible stories or events or people, and they would know who it is, which now you may have to paint color in the picture. You can't just draw the outline of David. You've got to paint it in a little bit, which is all right because the people who already know that David started out as a shepherd will nonetheless enjoy being refreshed with that little bit of knowledge. So I don't think it'll bore them to death, particularly if you do it in a clever way and say David, the boy who began as a shepherd and ended as a king. Or, as you all know, even though you're pretty sure half of them don't, as you all know, and that keeps from insulting your listeners.
Should preaching be something that is a central part of a church member's biblical study and devotional life?
Should it be? Probably not, but is it? Probably yes. Because probably most of the scripture they hear is my text that I read on Sunday morning. But that doesn't mean I'm going to read 40 verses, because they're going to quit listening after the first 4, so why read it? Nor, I do not like to say, open your Bibles, because if you do that, when you quit reading the text, they keep reading, and they keep reading, and they keep reading. You've gone all the way through your introduction, which they never heard, because they kept reading after you stopped. Let them read the Bible at home on their own time. I've only got 30 minutes. I don't want them taking my time to read. And I have never had somebody say, well, you said that was in the Bible, but it's not. So if you quote the Bible, if you paraphrase the Bible, I've never had people challenge that at all. But I'm not so concerned with how much Scripture is conveyed as I am with how deeply it impacts life. I'd rather people go home remembering one verse that impacted their life than having been exposed to 20 verses, some of which they didn't comprehend. So I'm not sure we can effectively address the problem of biblical illiteracy very well from the pulpit. Maybe if we get them intrigued that here's something interesting. Maybe there's something else interesting in here too. If that was interesting, maybe if I go home and turn a page, I'll find something interesting. So in that sense, we can kind of tease them perhaps into Bible study.
Is that not where our Sunday schools come in?
Well,
Hand on that?
theoretically, that's where our Sunday schools come in, for the few people who now attend Sunday school. But the adult classes I've been to, and when I started representing the mission, I visited a lot of churches. And I thought, these people don't go to Sunday school to learn. They go to Sunday school to connect. Because I have heard some pretty poor teaching in adult Sunday schools. And I don't think adults, for the most part, go to Sunday school to learn. They go to connect with friends and that sort of thing. I'm getting the sign here that the old clock on the wall says we need to wind this thing up. Sure. Always got time for Clint.
Oh, thank you. You're kind. You were known as a man who did not preach with notes. I mean, that was probably the most incredible thing about your reputation as a minister. Yet I heard kind of maybe a slight regret over that as you were talking earlier. If you had to do all over again, would you do that still?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, you like that?
Absolutely. But I will confess that when I preach without notes, in the back of my Bible is a key word list. And if I go blank, I can pull it out and see where I was and pick up again. But for years I worked from a key word list, not from a big outline. Because after all, one word will trigger your mind to remember. And then I decided I'll just memorize the key word list. And it's very easy to do. We got time for this. It's very easy to do. Because you associate those key words with your house. You start on the front porch. That's where you put your introduction. Put your conclusion on the back porch. Go through the house, and you attach those words to objects in your house that you can visualize. You know, a lot of things are written on the door of my refrigerator. Open the refrigerator, there's 3 shelves in there, something here and something here. And so that way, you can just mentally go through your sermon, even during the offering, you can sit there and just mentally go through it. But I keep the key word list because now, as I'm in the springtime of my senility, I tend once in a while to forget. And Dan Brown used to say, if you preach without notes, what do you do if you forget? And he said, you just keep preaching until you remember. But I certainly recommend preaching without notes. It makes me nervous to preach without notes. I mean, with notes. It makes me nervous. It makes me nervous tonight to preach with this, teach with this. Boss man?